Could the Philadelphia Flyers have made the biggest mistake of the trade deadline by rejecting what insiders are calling a moon offer from Toronto for Rasmus Ristolainen? That's the shocking revelation that has hockey fans questioning whether Philadelphia's front office completely bungled what might have been the most lopsided trade opportunity of the season. Let's be absolutely clear about what happened here. The Toronto Maple Leafs reportedly offered the moon for a 30-year-old defenseman who has now suffered season-ending injuries in back-to-back years. When a desperate playoff contender is willing to overpay dramatically for your aging, injury-prone asset, you take that deal and run to the bank. Philadelphia didn't, and the consequences of that decision are becoming more apparent by the day. The timing of this revelation makes it even more damning for the Flyers organization. Ristolainen played just 3 more games after the trade deadline before suffering another tricep injury that ended his season on March 11th. Philadelphia essentially chose to keep a player who gave them 3 games over what was apparently a franchise-altering package from Toronto. That's not just poor asset management, that's organizational malpractice. What makes this situation particularly infuriating is that we now know what Toronto was willing to give up for defensive help. They traded Fraser Minten, a 2026 first-round pick, and a 2025 fourth-round pick for Brandon Carlo, whose retained salary cap hit was significantly lower than Ristolainen's $5.1 million burden. If they were offering the moon for Ristolainen, we're potentially talking about an even more substantial package that Philadelphia simply refused to consider. The salary retention issue adds another layer of stupidity to Philadelphia's decision. The Flyers had already used their retention slots on other deals, meaning they couldn't reduce Ristolainen's cap hit for Toronto. This should have made them even more motivated to maximize the return for a player whose contract made him difficult to move. Instead, they chose to keep an expensive, injury-prone veteran on a rebuilding team that should be accumulating young assets and draft picks. Think about what the moon could have meant in this context. We're potentially talking about multiple first-round picks, top prospects like Easton Cowan or Ben Danford, and additional assets that could have accelerated Philadelphia's rebuild by years. The Flyers have been crying about needing young centers and defensive prospects, yet when Toronto apparently offered exactly those pieces, they said no. The irony is almost painful to consider. Philadelphia desperately needs the kind of young talent that Toronto was reportedly willing to part with, while Toronto needed immediate defensive help for a playoff push. This was the definition of a mutually beneficial trade that could have helped both organizations achieve their respective goals. Instead, Philadelphia chose loyalty over logic. From Toronto's perspective, this rejection probably saved them from making a massive mistake. Giving up premium assets for a player who would have contributed for exactly 3 games before getting injured again would have been catastrophic for their playoff chances. Sometimes the best trades are the ones that don't happen, and Toronto dodged a bullet here thanks to Philadelphia's stubbornness. But let's examine this from the Flyers' viewpoint, because their decision-making process reveals fundamental problems with how they approach asset management. Ristolainen is 30 years old, has a significant injury history, carries a hefty contract, and plays for a team that's clearly in rebuilding mode. These are exactly the circumstances where you maximize trade value rather than hoping things improve. The comparison to what other teams have done in similar situations is stark. Smart organizations identify when veteran players no longer fit their timeline and aggressively market them to contending teams willing to overpay. Philadelphia had apparently found that exact scenario with Toronto and chose to pass. That's the kind of decision that extends rebuilds unnecessarily and frustrates fan bases for years. Danny Briere and the Flyers front office seem to suffer from the same problem that has plagued many NHL general managers. They overvalue their own assets and underestimate market opportunities. When a team offers the moon for your player, you don't need to love the deal. You just need to recognize value and act accordingly. The subsequent injury makes this decision look even worse in hindsight. Not only did Philadelphia miss out on a potentially franchise-changing return, but they also lost their asset to injury. Anyway, they got the worst of both worlds, no trade return and no player contribution. That's the kind of outcome that gets general managers fired and sets organizations back for years. Looking ahead, Ristolainen's trade value has likely taken another significant hit due to his injury history. What Toronto was apparently willing to offer in March probably represents the peak of his market value. and Philadelphia may never see that kind of interest again. They had lightning in a bottle and chose to let it slip away. The broader implications for Philadelphia's rebuild are concerning. If they're not willing to move aging veterans for premium packages, how exactly do they plan to acquire the young talent necessary for sustainable success? You can't rebuild effectively if you're not willing to make difficult decisions about veteran players who don't fit your timeline. This situation also raises questions about Philadelphia's internal evaluation processes. Did they genuinely believe Ristolainen was more valuable to keep than whatever Toronto was offering? Or were they simply too attached to a player they had invested significant resources in acquiring? Either way, the decision-making appears fundamentally flawed. The most frustrating aspect for Flyers fans has to be the missed opportunity to accelerate their rebuild. Every rebuilding team dreams of finding contenders willing to overpay for their veterans, yet when Philadelphia found exactly that situation, they chose to keep the status quo. That's not just poor asset management, it's a failure to understand their own organizational needs. As we look toward future trade deadlines, this situation should serve as a cautionary tale for all organizations. When playoff contenders come calling with premium offers for your aging veterans, you seriously consider those proposals rather than letting loyalty or stubbornness cloud your judgment. Philadelphia may have cost themselves years of development by rejecting what could have been a transformational trade package. What do you think about Philadelphia's decision to keep Ristolainen over accepting Toronto's moon offer? Was this organizational loyalty taken too far, or do you think the Flyers made the right call? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you're as frustrated as I am by missed trade opportunities, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more analysis of NHL front office decisions.